Whenever anybody presses record, I always want to say something silly, but I won't. Welcome, glad that you're here, and our conversation is called Pathways to Freedom, Evolution, and the Next Step, Class 1. I'm very grateful to be here. Just some review that might help us kind of get the juices flowing. And like I said, some of this might be review from our previous conversations, but also it might be new to somebody. One of the questions that we have often as human beings or as human beings is what kind of universe or what kind of world are we living in? And throughout time, you may know that has been tossed around by philosophers and scientists, poets, thinkers of all kinds. For a long time, the conversation really kind of settled on this being a fixed world, that we are living in a fixed world and a fixed universe with a fixed understanding of what is going on, that people and things and all the stuff around us kind of follows a repeated but standard pattern. And that repeated standard pattern is set on a planet that is a fixed space. And around that fixed space, there seems to be all kinds of things going on, but whatever is going on right here is kind of set, predictable, and orderly. And you would recognize this by reading the scriptures. You'd recognize it by reading ancient texts of poetry or ancient creation stories, that there's this firmament, there's this fixed place, there's this ordered thing that happens, and it just, boom, there it is, and that's how it works. Science, of course, asks that question more often than I think. Well, let me back up. That's not entirely nice to say it this way. Science asks the questions, though, of what is really going on and continue to probe at it. Interestingly enough, religion sometimes asks those questions with the same amount of energy as science. What's curious is that religious life often tried to not ask those questions as well, because sometimes if you ask those questions too aggressively, you poke and probe at sacred texts and sacred understandings that seem to be really important to keep fixed. So there's this little tug and pull sometimes, not always, around what it means to be a person of science and a person of faith. For, of course, incredible number of years, the church was, in people of faith, not only the Christian community, but also Islam and other religious traditions, probed and asked those questions with great expansiveness and great creativity. And we're less afraid of having the questions of faith be interrupted by that. But then at times, we might recognize in our modern times, there often is this tussle back and forth between science and religion. And what are we talking about? So when a church puts together a conversation that uses the word evolution in it, I know, that that's a loaded prospect because sometimes evolution is a concept that religious people find a problem embracing. And so it's worth spending some time thinking about what we are learning about evolution and what evolution can teach us, not only about how creatures evolve, about how the stuff evolved and what the science of that can tell us, but also embracing the possibility that not only is it about the stuff, the individuals, the creatures, and the dirt, the soil, all of it, there also might be something going on that might be what we might call mystical, or in the world of religion that might be going on as well. That evolution might not only be a scientific theory, it might also be a mystical consciousness. It might be the way in which we understand who we are, how we are, where we fit in the world, but also how we think, how we embrace, and it might actually challenge and maybe expand our understanding of some of our religious claims that we've made over the years. So if life unfolds as an evolution, does spirituality unfold? Does faith unfold? Does the way we think about God unfold and evolve over time? And if so, where does that take us? So that's part of what we're here to do, is to continue that conversation as well. So I'll hand this off to Don. That's probably enough of an introduction. I can keep going.
So this notion of things being fixed, and this is an ancient notion that's persisted over the centuries in religion, but also in spirituality, because spirituality oftentimes says that this is either illusory, this world that we're in, or it's a fall from grace, and the purpose of life is to go back to the original way that things were, to go back to this idyllic state of perfection. But it also views there being a separation between manifestation, the biggest split there could possibly be between manifestation and what's either called the transcendent or the divine. So, if evolution is taking place in the world, it's not a part of main spirituality across the board of traditions. And I've studied many, many different spiritual pathways. But you seldom come across the notion that what's called the divine or what's called the transcendent also co-evolves with what's in manifestation. That's a radically new idea that you won't find in religious scriptures. But the way I look at religious scriptures, the sacred texts of the different traditions, and you can look at them historically, I look at them as an ongoing journal, so to speak, between humans and what they consider to be the divine, and it represents an evolution in thinking that's taken place over the centuries of what that relationship is about and what, quote, the other side is about, the divine side of things. So come about 800 years or more ago, Ibn Arabi, who was a great Sufi mystic, said that human beings are beings of bi-unity, bi-unity, which means we are human-divine beings. And he says some things that are just really mysterious. He says that neither side of that can exist without the other, and even more mind-blowing, he says that each side is the creator of the other side. So put that on your head and think about that, that not just, well, we are the result of the divine creating us in manifestation, but he says that the manifest beings create what we consider to be the divine side. They co-create each other. So this is much more consistent with quantum theory, that we don't live in a causality-driven world of like billiard balls, that things are intertwined with each other. The term is entanglement. Our notions of time are not the way that things really are. Time is not just this arrow that moves from past to present and future, but time is relative. And depending on your frame of reference, from one frame of reference, our universe would appear to be going backwards in time from another universe. And that universe would be appearing to go backwards in time from this universe. Okay, so pathways to freedom. What does that mean? We are familiar with the notion of being on a spiritual path. But oftentimes we think that that path is predetermined by whatever belief system we're a part of. These are the things you're supposed to do, and if you do these things, you will eventually arrive at the destination. Salvation, in Christianity, you're saved, you go to heaven. In yoga and Buddhism, you achieve a state of nirvana. You'll achieve a state of, in yoga, nirvikalpa samadhi, where any semblance of identity is gone. You're just merged in the infinite ocean of bliss for all eternity. So these are notions. There's a notion of a finish line, so to speak, in these different traditions. But we live in a universe that is evolving all the time. The nature of our universe is a principle of self-organization. Life is always seeking to organize to a higher level of being. And consciousness is seeking to organize to a higher capacity for consciousness. So with that, there can't possibly be an end point. There's a forward thrust of the purpose of being here. So we can think of our spiritual path as not being one where we're trying to arrive at some finish line, erase our identity, go to some place after this life and stay there forever, but rather participating in this coevolution of not just us as manifest beings, but what we consider the divine. And that coevolution can only take place by virtue of our relationship between what we know of our manifest sense of ourselves and our transcendent sense of self. And then one more thing before I turn the ball back to Jonathan. Those of you that have been to previous classes, we've talked about the notion that we live in a simulation. So we don't really live in the true nature of reality. We live in a projection. It's kind of like the holodeck in Star Trek, a projection of the way that we think that things are, And it's the world conditioned by our physical senses. It's the world conditioned by our concepts about what we experience, our emotional responses to that. And because that's the status quo for virtually all of humanity, we don't even question that there could be anything else. Well, of course, that's reality. And we try to make sense of our life and the purpose of our life from that frame of reference, which is limited and could never possibly get to where we think we're wanting to get to.
I'm trying to process through my head and heart that we just brought up the idea of holodeck and Star Trek, and my heart was warmed. I teach at a class on kind of a semi-regular basis, along with the rabbi at Congregation Beth Israel in town. And many of you have known about this or been around it. The previous rabbi, Rabbi Elon Emanuel's relocated to the Northeast. And the new rabbi is a delightful, delightful human being, Gabriella Cohn. So I recommend getting to know Gabby and the life that is unfolding in the congregation. So we continued that work here this year. And I just finished my second one. And as I do that work, I'm always stunned. I'm stunned. And I don't know if anybody's been in those classes, but fully 60 to 100% of what I do in that room as a pastor in the Christian church is sit with people, with Jewish people, and who are reading in community, 30 to 50 of us, puzzling through Torah, one little bit at a time. And every single time, maybe every single class session, I usually do a discourse about how Christians, not all Christians, but how many Christians, and how many what we might call kind of familiarly recognizable Christians in our kind of common parlance, argue about Scripture and what that's like to live in that world. So I did that yesterday. I didn't think I was going to have to, but it just became very clear that there was a conversation on the table, and some of the community that were from the Christian communities in the room, but also we were talking one way, and some of the Jewish community was talking about another way, and I recognized some of the kind of, wow, this is really different, and making sure that we pay attention to this. The way Elon Emanuel would say, that Rabbi Elon would say it is this: Jews take Scripture seriously enough to never take it literally. Let's let that sink in. Taking a sacred story seriously enough to not let it be literal. Because what happens when you make something literal, a story perhaps, is that you suck all the life out of it. You denude it of any circulation, any texture, any vibrancy, and you take away its three-dimensionality. It becomes very flat, very static, and very dead. And then all we're doing with that story is forcing ourselves to comply with that non-living story. But we're living. If it seems to you that you've struggled with that way of reading ancient stories, whether Christian, Hindu, Muslim, Jewish, if it seems to you that you've had problems with reading stories that way, that's your very three-dimensional, respiratory, organic self, your quantum self, saying, reading story this way is taking life out of me. And I can't live in that space reading stories that way. Okay? So when I think of when I hear simulation, part of the simulation is a very two-dimensional story with which we comply. And our job is to try to live into that two-dimensional, non-respiratory, inorganic story. And we spend a lot of time trying to do that. Not only with stories that we've been given by sacred communities, but also stories that we've been given by our families, stories that we've been given by our loved ones, scripts that we've been given by our society or our government or whoever that might be. We force our three-dimensional quantum selves into two-dimensional spaces all the time. And when we do that, we find ourselves dying right where we are. So if it seems like intuitively, you've been in a space where the way it talks, the way the space works, the way the conversations happen, the way energy is kind of flowing is soul-killing, soul-sucking, and doesn't have energy. It's just very flat, and you kind of go, God, this is just, I'm done. It's probably your intuition saying, there's a lot of simulation here, and not a whole lot of full quantum life here. This is what Jesus of Nazareth was saying in the Gospel of John, among other places, when he says, he doesn't say, I have come that you might have life, or I've come that you might be saved. Well, he doesn't say, I've come that you might be saved. He doesn't come that you might, at the end of your life, find yourself in heaven. He doesn't come to say that I'm come to make sure that you comply appropriately with the scriptures as I interpret them. And he says none of those things. And here's the thing. He could have said that. And there were plenty of people, of colleagues in his time, that were saying things like that. The Essenes were very rigorous about complying with a certain way of life and a certain way of living. And that's not to say the Essenes were bad, but there are many religious movements that have a very, very narrow understanding of what it means to be in this space. And yet something interrupted that, not only with Jesus of Nazareth, but with his mystical followers that came on. And here's the cool thing: not only with Muhammad, but also with his followers, as the expansive mystics continue to do it as well. Not only with the leaders of many faiths, but also with their followers afterwards, that people embracing a mystical consciousness recognize that what we're talking about here is not flat words on a page, it's an entire expanse of life. And there might be more linkages, as we talk about this with multiple faiths, faithfully following our own faith, but doing so with this non-simulation, with this expansive quantum possibility, right? So then when Jesus talks about it, he says, because he's the best teacher I know, he's my teacher, right? So I'm going to follow Jesus of Nazareth and the folks that wrote about him. That's kind of the way that this works, is that you spend a lot of time talking about Ibn Arabi and the Sufi mystic tradition, and I spend a lot of time talking about the Christian mystic tradition that I know, and we find linkages with one another, not because we are trying to live into our traditions two-dimensionally on the page, but because we recognize that what we're talking about is all this vast three-dimensional life into which one tradition and another tradition and many other traditions have tried to weave poetry and weave insight and weave story and weave possibility, all of which is always constantly evolving. So when Jesus says, I've come that they might have life, he doesn't leave it there. I have come that they might have life and might have it abundantly. Not that I will come to make sure that they comply, but I'll come to have life, respiratory, full, mystical consciousness life.
And these teachers, through the ages, the masters, the saints, and prophets, how did they teach? They taught in parables, they taught in metaphors, and the Hindu scriptures are called the Gitas, which means songs.
Yes.
So we normally live in a dualistic frame of reference. There's me, there's everything else. I want to try to understand who I am and what this is, which is separate from myself.
Keep going.
And we live in a reality in which we can't possibly truly understand what that reality is about from that frame of reference. So all the teachers that have come along offered clues, signs to us. They weren't meant to be the absolute, but they were pointers, something that a lot of times boggled your mind. Sufi stories always have a twist in them, and that's a very different way of looking at that. Buddhist koans, what's the sound of one hand clapping? Well, try to figure that out with your mind. You can't, but the idea is your mind gets boggled enough till it lets go of its usual way of thinking, and then you have a breakthrough into experiencing a deeper way of understanding, which has always been available to you, but what's clouded that, what's obscured that, is your normal frame of reference. Mm-hmm. You're being stuck in the simulation. So poets, musicians, anybody who's had a deep expression, great composers, you listen to Bach or Beethoven, it transports you into something else. They were communicating a very deeper way of experiencing reality, that when you used their gift, whether it was written or music or movement or whatever it might be, or a story, then it helped take you to a different place, at least temporarily. And then we come back from that space, and then what do? Wow, I had the most wonderful, mystical experience, I want to try to recreate that. So let me see what I was doing. Oh yeah, I was doing this and this and this. And you try to do it again, and it does not work. And then you go, well, at least I can recall the experience. And then you know, at first you're really feeling it, and maybe you're telling someone else about it, but by about the 10th time, it's all the juice has gone out of it, and it's might as well be something in the newspaper. And a term that's come to me lately, it's become fossilized. Instead of a living experience, you're living in a fossil of the way that things are. You're trying to wrap up a temporary experience that gave you a clue into how you could be much more of the time, and you're trying to make that be the way that things are, and it never ever works. And then we get frustrated, and then we think, well, you know, maybe I need to meditate more hours a day. Maybe I need to go see this teacher or that teacher because I hear they're really good. They're going to somehow zap me or impart something to me, and nobody can do it for you. So again, the first part of the title of this series, Pathways to Freedom. Each of us is on our own unique pathway to experiencing the true nature of our soul, which is the nature of freedom, and it's never anybody else's pathway. We can have guidance, and guidance is very important, usually from a living teacher at first that can give us pointers along the way. Like if you were going to learn how to climb a mountain, well, you better have a guide for a long time that shows you what to do before you do it yourself. But eventually you're going to have to be able to figure out how to chart your own way up that mountain. So our pathway is not fixed. It's not predetermined. There's not a certain way that we are supposed to go. And that's why the end of the title of this series, After Evolution, is the next step. One of the things I love the most about Pir Vilayat, who was my teacher in the Sufis for 25 years, when I would meet with him, he wouldn't tell me what to do. He would say, well, I can see that this may be your next step. He'd give me a pointer, something that would help me move in a certain direction, but he wasn't trying to prefigure how I should turn out or what it should look like. You know, he was willing to see me in the possibilities of what could unfold from me, but not in his image of what I was supposed to do. So one beautiful image the Sufis have about when someone joins a spiritual pathway, let's say they get initiated into a spiritual school, that they're joining a caravan of kindred-seeking souls that continues in this life and beyond. But each person in that caravan, you're traveling in good company, it's called satsang, is walking their own path, but you have this wonderful support system. And not only that, you have your path, everyone else has their path, but the interplay between you and another person walking their path, there's something that transpires. Let's say it's just another person. There's a light that's circulated between the two of you that now opens up insights that neither of you could have had on your own. And I'm sure all of you, and those of you listening to this on YouTube, have had this experience. You're having a conversation with a dear friend, and at first it's just kind of mundane, but then you really get deeper into it, and each of you finds yourself having an insight that's surprising to you. This is one thing I love about teaching, because almost without fail, every time I'm presenting something, just in the midst of it, I'll have an insight that I hadn't thought of before, but it's by virtue of my desire to share something, but also all of you who are listening to this, there's an interplay between both sides of that enables something to come forth that's the product of that relationship, not just me tapping into the Akashic records up there somewhere, or something that's sitting in the Akashic library. So one more thing I want to say about this. I think there's so many old notions, and I must say outdated notions of spirituality. One is that God is fixed and doesn't evolve. Another, that revelation is a discovery of something pre-existent. And I think revelation is a discovery of something that's revealed that has never been there before, but could only come by virtue of you and all the wisdom you bring from your life's experiences in relationship with the other half of you, even Barbie, the other side of that hyphen, your divine being. That relationship, both sides together are birthing a revelation that was not ever there before. It's something new that comes through. And the Sufis say that creation started because God was a hidden treasure desiring to be known, and that God could only know of him herself through the relationship with manifest beings. Well, what is it that God knows? Well, you could say it's called wisdom. Well, what is that wisdom? It's not just something, we learned how to cook this recipe and that God knows now how to bake bread. No. It's a wisdom that comes through our experience in life, interplaying with the wisdom that the divine has of the divine's own being of us. Those two sides coming together unfolds a wisdom. So you could say, well, what's the purpose of there being a manifestation? It's the never-ending augmentation of the wisdom of existence that we participate in. And each of us, this is another wonderful thing about Ibn Arabi. Anybody that has low self-esteem, if you buy this one, you can't keep having low self-esteem. You just can't do it. And what he says is every being, without exception, has access to a unique part of the divine wisdom that no other soul ever has or could or will have access to. And this was in the 1200s, the most radical thing to say, particularly for a Muslim. He said that God told the Prophet Muhammad that the Prophet Muhammad needed to learn from his followers because each of them had access to some of the divine wisdom that even the Prophet Muhammad couldn't have access to. And so something that struck me a while ago was that we think of these beings like Buddha was enlightened. Well, he knew everything. Well, Buddha knew everything that the Buddha could possibly know at that particular snapshot of the Buddha's participation in the ongoing evolution of existence. But there are things that the Buddha couldn't possibly know that only could be known by us. And the same thing with fill in the blank, Christ, Moses, you name it. So talk about a purpose of being in the world. We have something we can bring forth. And the term for that process to bring it forth in Hinduism is called dharma, our spiritual purpose or duty. And that doesn't mean doing all these spiritual things. Maybe it is for some people, but it means the expression of the fullness of your being in life that helps to unfold that wisdom.
I wonder if we might want to pause for any questions or conversations. So let's maybe do it this way. We've blurted a lot out. Let's just have maybe 20 seconds or 25 seconds of quiet, and then maybe I'll invite us into a time of asking questions. And thank you. Amen. Who is that? Yes, okay.
And we're recording this, so if you would speak up so it'll show up on the recording.
What Jesus said, you said, I couldn't really understand that. You said, Jesus said, I'm here to bring...
He said, I have come that you might have life and might have it abundantly.
Thank you.
It's my experience, the more you open or have that quantum way of thinking or being, then you see more commonalities, and then you just see it everywhere. Kind of different faith traditions or nature, it just, as you said, any sacred scripture, if you take it seriously and not literally, then it seems to be basically saying, at least to me, kind of the same thing.
Yeah, so I think so. And here I might add that Don and I are not quantum physicians. We're not physicists. That when we talk about quantum, at least when I talk about quantum, I'm using it as a shorthand for infinite expansiveness, which is one of the ideas, not the only idea in quantum physics, which is that there's this expansiveness that is not only, in this kind of temporal universe, but it's both with time and space and all, and there's this infinitude. That I think is a way of describing, and quantum for me is a placeholder for a long paragraph, right? But yes, and I think that is what's interesting is that we find that intuition exposed in ancient scriptures. Read the Psalms, but also read the Song of Solomon. The multiple textures and layers and understandings of love and intimacy. So there's this kind of intuition that I think is there that for some reason and for many reasons we don't want to talk about all that here can sometimes get flattened. And I think what we're always trying to do is kind of re-inhabit that. For instance, I see that in the Moses story. I think that very quickly the people of Israel living in a very two-dimensional story where, we're captives and there's nothing to do about this. And that we've been forgotten and we live in this linear space where this is the only space in which we can live. And immediately then, not immediately, but over time, the story three-dimensionalizes very, very quickly. This somehow otherworldly being has heard and listened and now is acting. All of a sudden what's here is not just here, it's over there as well. And there's a big thing going on that we are all in the midst of, caught up in the midst of. And it's this idea of justice and freedom, and right? So it's there, but I don't know that we always talk that way.
Right, or I mean, maybe not the same, but the same dynamic, like going in the same direction, the same convergence of...
Yeah.
Well, and if I could add something to this that Jonathan was referring to earlier, the many layers of stories and not just the obvious literal one. So the story of Jesus restoring the sight to the blind man, if you read that, at first, when the blind man could first see, he said, everyone looks like trees. And this was an insight that came to me many, many years ago. And then Jesus did something and he could see the way people usually see. Well, Jesus had to tamp down that person's perception of reality because he couldn't cope with it. And what that, to me, the esoteric meaning of that, if you've seen a picture of the tree of life in the Kabbalah, it is a tree. It's called the tree of life. It's the different sephirot, the different stations of relationship between manifestation and divinity. So he was seeing the sephirot of the people around him, but he couldn't make any sense of that, so had to come back down to just seeing their physical bodies. Mm-hmm. So there's so many layers of these things. And I believe one of my fundamental assumptions is that everything without exception is a portal, an opening to the sacred. And that doesn't mean that you find a way of relating to it and it's opened up the sacred, now everything's going to magically become wonderful. No, it's going to perhaps be just as bad externally as it was, but your way of relating to it now has opened up a possibility for something that can arise in you and also in that external situation, maybe not right away, but like a catalyst. So truth is to be found everywhere, not just in scriptures, although that's certainly a very valuable source, but in listening to a bird singing, seeing a little child smiling, any number of things coming along, something humorous. I'll share a quickie one. When I was in my psychology practice, this is the days you had to pay for long distance phone calls. And I did my own billing. I had to check with Medicare to find out something about a bill for a client. So I call them at 10 minutes after 4, and I'm on hold for 20 minutes, and the music is playing. And at 4:30, it says that the Medicare office is now closed, but they kept the background music going. And the music was, I'm not making this up, I can't get no satisfaction. And I said, that was worth it.
That's the divine. Something's going on.
Yeah. The universe has a good sense of humor.
Any other questions, feedback?
Yeah.
It just reminded me when you were talking about the Jesus and the blind man story. There's a similar path similarity in Bhagavad Gita where there's a presentation to Prince Arjuna. Krishna presents him his whole glory, which is God and the universe, and Arjuna, or the prince, asks him to dial it down so that he can see him again.
Right.
Because he's in awe and because he cannot comprehend the fullness.
Yeah.
Right.
So there's a similarity in the Hindu tradition of this. And then another thing, I kind of wanted to push back, because we use the word simulation a lot, and I kind of wanted to push back on it because simulation to me kind of meant a little bit of like removal of the experience of both realities that we have to reconcile when we live, you know what I mean? So when we talk about a portal through which we can see God, or everything can be a devotion, and you talk about, you know, smiling child, this is a sensory experience of this life, of a human existence. And there is another reality that we are God, and then there is a divinity in everything. So when I hear a word simulation, it kind of makes me, it gives like a veil of removal or something synthetic about it, where it's a very organic experience. But the difficulty, I think, is recognizing both realities, that they're both real, that the sensory experience of human is very real, and the experience of us being God is very real. And I think the cognitive dissonance is stepping into this in-betweenness and continuously reuniting both of those within all the time. And I think that's the most difficult thing.
When we talk about simulation, it's being stuck in a limitation of a perception of reality that is confined just to the world of the senses. And certainly there's a reality to the world of the senses, but what we can take into our physical senses, even, you know, the animals that can see ultraviolet and infrared, and can hear sounds that we can't hear. The world looks very different. Even in space, if you've seen pictures from astronomy, radio astronomy and so on, the universe looks very different than what we can see through an optical telescope. There's much more to it. So we're just thinking that that's all that there is, and the reality is there's much more.
And we're trying to encourage, when we use the word simulation, we're trying to encourage going beyond that simulation. So we're not saying the simulation is where we want to be. The simulation is a piece of our life, but going beyond that further. As you're describing, I think language-wise, we're trying to use or go in the similar trajectory. The simulation and is that this is all that matters, and there might be other words for it, but there's always more texture and always more possibilities. So.
Well, and also the simulation is that the belief that we are separate from everything that we experience.
Right.
That's an illusion.
That's
that is not the true nature of reality, but it's the apparent perception of reality that most people live in. Yes?
So when you said simulation, I thought about Plato's allegory of the cave.
Right.
Yeah.
Classic.
That we're chained up, we can only see the shadows of things, and if we can find a portal, you know, or understand reality better, we turn around, or we can break those chains and make that connection.
Yeah. Plato and Platonism and Neoplatonism is it's worth a deep dive, or kind of a somewhat of a dig, because I think that's unintentional. We find ourselves repeating that idea where we say all the time, it's too glorious for us to behold, which is one of the things that Christianity does with Platonism, and so then we only can see the bare shadow of it. Okay, at least this is the way I and others read the revelation of Jesus of Nazareth, is that it's not too bright for us to behold. It's not too bright for us to behold. That it might be bright, it might be amazing, it might be intense, but we are able to see it. That doesn't mean that we all see it the same way, but we can behold it. Rather than turn away from it and see the shadow of it, why don't we turn around and see the glory of it, the possibility of it? And I think that's a story that is being repeated over and over again. So when Paul talks about the glory of Christ, one of the metaphors that he uses deeply is, it might be as near as right here. We might be the body of Christ. That the shadow, that what's projecting in the shadow of the cave, the big glory that might be so big, that's shining so brightly that we can't look at it. Maybe we can look at it because we're already looking at it.
Well, if I could add to that, there are some Sufis that have a practice, and do not try this, who gaze into the sun, but their eyes don't burn out. And one of the ones that did this when asked about it. He says, when you have eyes like the sun, then you can gaze into the sun. And so these things where it says, well, it's, no man can gaze upon the face of God and live. Absolutely true. You cannot be in a dualistic frame of reference. Your circuits are going to be fried. But if you're living in the true nature of your being, you can experience that, but you're not going to experience in the way that you're used to of, here I am, oh wow, look at this IMAX show. You're living in it, and we don't have good words in English to describe it, but you're being that.
Right.
And that's what mystical experiences are about, having a state of consciousness that does not fit into a dualistic frame of reference and could never get from here to there. It is the true quantum leap to be there. And I want to say one more comment about when I talk about a portal, because you might be thinking of a portal like you're on a boat, you're looking out the window, and when I talk about a portal, it means an opening to a different state of beingness. You're not going to another place. You're opening to a way of experiencing the world that you live in and have always lived in, but you haven't been able to know that because you've been constricted to the world of the senses and thoughts and emotions.
So then, Julian of Norwich, right? Great mystic, living in the midst of horrible times, living in the midst of the plagues, somehow has an experience where she says, and you know it, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Living in the midst of my youthfulness, I heard that and thought, that's really cool. I have no idea what the hell she's talking about. Because I was in my youthfulness. I was in my youthfulness living, I would say, in more of a two-dimensional simulation existence, as many of us do, as kind of the progression of life unfolds. But now I've been through some stuff. And I've been through heartache. And we have. And I've tried to raise kids. Jennifer and I have worked together to raise a couple of guys. And we've come through maybe a hurricane or two. And we've come through some struggle. Life, death, the mystery of life unfolds. Oh. And even in the midst of that, and all shall be. So the stories that we tell of the great struggles of our lives are at the exact same time that when I go through my phone pictures, or when I go through the memories, or when I read through my journals, these great things happen. Wait a minute. I mean, in the middle of that horrible thing, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all. Oh, that might not just be my existence. That might be existence. That might be all of it. That expansiveness might be the depth of that. That's the wisdom that we're trying to get into. A challenge with that is that we live in systems, we often find ourselves in systems that are very conversant in that understanding of life. And those systems often have a lot of influence in our daily life. And the challenge then is trying to live in the midst of language and metaphors that are very fixed. At the same time, being Julian of Norwich, having this consciousness. And by the way, Julian locked herself away.
She was an anchoress.
Yeah, she was an anchoress. Not because she was a radical introvert, and not because she had problems with people. She knew that what she had to give was so remarkable that she needed to tend that well, and that the world or her immediate surroundings could only take that in that, what do we say, that we didn't say dumbed down, but that limited amount of brightness, that constriction can only, so people would come to her, right? They would come to her little door and get little bits of insight from her, and then their minds would be blown in the midst of the plagues. And then they would come back for a little bit more, and their minds would be blown in the midst of that.
Well, and I have an add-on to this, speaking of language.
It's a great story.
If you're familiar with if you've ever been to a Passover Seder, there's a part where the word dayenu, D-A-Y-E-N-U, which means it would have been enough. And it said, if God had just freed us from the Pharaoh, dayenu, it would have been enough. If God had just taken us into exile and kept us safe in the dying. There's a whole bunch of these. It would have been enough. But what we tend to do, and this is human nature, we have an experience, a wonderful experience, and we feel like, this is it. We maybe don't know this word, but Diana, we're going, well, this is it. This is enough. And then we try to lock things in to that instead of realizing that the nature of creation is it's made anew at every instant. There's always more. There's always even more than that. There's always better than that. So instead of looking backwards and holding on to an experience,
right,
we're just, we're present to it. We can enjoy it, and then we're open to the discovery of the next one. But in between, we have these periods, Sufi terms, some of you have heard about fana, which means shattering, F-A-N-A, and baka, which means rebirth or resurrection. We have periods where things seem to break down in our life. And all the things that were working in our belief systems, our way of understanding, and it could be triggered by a tragedy, a loss, an illness, a crisis of faith, whatever it might be. And then we're in this period where we don't know what things are going to be. The way that things don't work anymore, and we're trying to piece together something that does, and it just isn't fitting. And then ultimately we just have to be able to let go, and we're in this in-between state. It's like the caterpillar in the chrysalis, where the caterpillar literally liquefies in the process of becoming the butterfly, and then emerges as something so beautiful. And so when we learn to recognize that this is an inherent property of life, and a term that came to me some time ago is the gentle fana. We're still going to have these heavy-duty experiences, but if we recognize them for, okay, this is going to be a time of a transition and an organization to an even fuller state of being, I'm going to open to it. I'm going to open to possibilities as yet unknown to me, and as yet unknown to what we think of as God or the divine or the transcendent, and I'm going to be in this period of mystery and self-organization for something to emerge that's even more than it was before. And then we're really walking on a pathway to freedom, which inherently incorporates evolution, and there's always the next step. There's always something more than what's been before. We're not, there's a principle in yoga, Buddhism, of non-attachment. And we might think of that, oh, well, that's just somebody just doesn't care about it. They're apathetic. No. It means they're fully living, but they're not holding on to what they're experiencing. They're not grasping onto it. They're just opening to what comes next and to what comes next. And then we are in a space of freedom, which is what the nature of our souls is meant to be. We're not meant to be stuck, although sometimes it seems like that we are.
And a way that some Christian traditions talk about this is the cycle of creation, brokenness, death, and resurrection. It's a familiar cycle for those of us. Some people, there's an educational community here at All Saints that it's called Education for Ministry, and that's a familiar cycle that group teaches. But it's not just that group; it's the revealed cycle of life. That there's this continual pattern. So if we recognize that that's the cycle, right? That's the cycle.
It's a spiral.
Yeah, it's either a spiral or an ongoing. I have a teacher that would do it in spirals, but they were always going this way because they're always growing. That there's this wonderful kind of progression, or spirally upward if you're a spiral dynamics person. This whole idea that is not something we get to enter ourselves into. We're already in it. What we're trying to do is understand it. And what the practices are, then, the practices of mystical traditions, are not practices that they themselves can deliver the goods. They're not intended to make sure that they deliver the goods definitively. What they are is practices that help us understand what is already true. There's nothing new that can be delivered in the Eucharist about me being nourished. You're not going to get anything in the Eucharist that's going to be brand new. What it might do is open our hearts to embrace fully that nourishment already is. And that miracle of nourishment is as near to us as a crusty, bad-tasting piece of bread and some really cheap sweet wine. It's that close. It's that near to us. What we need is practices that help us understand it. Open my eyes that I can see. By the way, there's a reason we sing that all the time at All Saints. Open my eyes that I may see. Open my ears, open my heart, open all of it. Not because something is going to be delivered to us that is unique and unseen or was never there before. It's because it's already radically present. And we're opening ourselves to receive what is already true. So when we talk about all of these paths, this is not new teaching. This is teaching that is already here. We already have it. What we're trying to understand is the world or the life in which we are living in a new way. Because that life is already there. It's already the truth.
Well, and also with this, I would say 999 out of 1,000 people would say there's just one resurrection. Okay, even if they're just talking about Christ, if they think, well, each Christian is going to become resurrected, well, I would say resurrection is a never-ending process that we go through numerous times in this life and beyond, and it's the furtherance of the evolution of our relationship, not just in the transcendent dimension with what we think of as the divine, but our relationship with everything in existence. Every being, everything that we think of as inanimate and animate in life and subtle realms, that relationship is opened up to further possibilities. So the whole universe, we think of awakening. Oh, this is my path of awakening. I want to become illuminated. I want to become enlightened. Well, that's fine. But I think at a certain point we realize, I thought this was just about me because I wanted to get to this place like the Buddha or, but ultimately it's the whole of existence is awakening to itself in a deeper and deeper way of being that we're in total communion with always and in a relationship with always. And so all of existence is awakening, but we can contribute to the furtherance of that process by us discovering the true nature of our being, which we're going to get to in future classes, that we don't just exist in physical manifestation. We exist on multiple subtle levels, and I've come to call them multiple vibrational levels of existence that we can first learn how to experience one by one, but gradually we can open up to experience all those levels of ourself simultaneously as the wholeness of our being and feel this circulation of light that takes place descending and ascending and outward and inward that's going on all the time. So that way of being is enabling much more to come through, much more wisdom to arise in existence than could ever take place by what we think of as this limited sense of self sitting here on the stool talking to you.
Right. So there's this thing where Bishop Curry, among others, Bishop Michael Curry, previous presiding bishop in the Episcopal Church, among others, where he would say, and others have said and continue to say, that the greatest heresy or the greatest problem we have in our faith system in Christianity is, and particularly in this country, is the heresy of individualism, which is the only, I think it's like the biggest one. And when people start talking that way, it's like, ooh, heresy is a strong word. Be careful about that. Well, heresies are classically understood to be ideas or understandings, not that will keep you from God. Good luck. You can't do that, by the way. But that incorrectly teach the reality that is around us, right? And that's one of the biggest ones, is to say that you are an individual having individual experience. Not true. Never has been true. There's no religious tradition in the world that actually embraces that it's all about the individual. Yet somehow we have a spirituality that often it's all about me. Yes, I say this in sermons frequently, it's all about you, and it is not at all about you. Yes, you have your work to do, and you're doing your work in this vastness, right? And then when we say things like God, and I know that you and I both do this when we talk about God, but we're not talking about God. We're talking about God. We're talking about all of it in the middle of it. So to continue to say, I've got to work on this me all by myself, is to deny this companionship we have with all of creation. And with all the divine and all of the sister and brother bits and organism pieces that are all around us, in which we find ourselves living, which is infused with God's presence.
Yes, and I would like to add to that.
We always
It's
do.
not about us as a separate individual on this pathway to getting somewhere.
Never is.
But each of us is a unique expression of manifest divinity that's unique in all of existence. So I think it's all about us enhancing our modality, our way of relationship with everything that we experience. And that way of relationship that I have with everything else is totally different from yours and yours and yours. And so it's the evolution of that relationship, which is what spirituality is meant to be about. It's never, well, it has been taken as that. It's never really truly meant to be about just getting Joe Blow over here, over to there. It's the furtherance of all of existence awakening to itself. And I've said this before in previous classes. Seth Lloyd is a computer scientist at MIT, and this was in Scientific American, postulated that the whole universe is a giant quantum computer, and then asked, well, what is it computing? And he said, itself. And basically he was saying in science language, the universe was seeking to understand itself. Same thing the Sufis said thousands of years ago. And every single part, which is totally interconnected with everything else, is part of that awakening process. And without the contribution that each person has to that process can never be as full as it would be otherwise. So that's what our Dharma is.
Right, our path.
And that's what, when I said saying earlier, I don't think that was the best word. And kind of like what Thomas Keating said, I think it's such a unique time that we are in right now because of the language. Like, this is the first time that we can even try to converse, because the words that we use, the other doesn't understand. And one of the things that he says, like a portal, he said failure is a path to God. Or that St. Teresa says everything is a grace. I guess that's what I meant by the saying, like that portal, you feel like it's a dead end, but it's not. It's not the same, but we're all, as Kay Hart said, that we're turning into a new creation together.
Yeah.
Something.
And this,
That leads to evolution. We'll get to that next week. Yeah.
it's 10:15 too.
Yeah, that opens up a conversation then about what can evolutionary consciousness hold for us as we do this work, and we'll get into that next week. So thank you for your time and presence. Thank you, Don, for your wisdom. Very grateful.
Thank you, Jonathan.